All right, so today we're going to take a look at soldering up the headers on the two relay board. So the WMR 32 or ESP32 WMR relay board. So I have one here on the screen. It's still sort of in the package. I cut the end off, so I'm just going to pull it out of there and we can get started and take a look at it. And of course, this is how you would get it if you didn't have the headers soldered in for you. I'm going to show you what I would do if you ordered it with the headers soldered in. So yeah, so let's get started. So we'll pull this guy out of the bag. Right, it has some headers in the bag as I get them from my supplier. I'm going to set this, actually, I'm going to toss that bag because I'm going to use this one. So we've got a couple different headers here, right? We've got the two 10 pin by 2, and we've got the 6-pin header for communications. And a lot of times I actually find that there's one or two of these jumpers in here, although they don't actually have any like known use in the app setup. So typically they go off to the side if I'm soldering the headers in. Sometimes I'll stick one off on the side. But let's take a look at it. So the idea here is we have to solder our 6-pin into that one there. We have to put the 2 in here, right? And it's not terribly difficult, but when you typically you put these guys in, right? In order to solder them, you need to solder them on the bottom, right? And it's actually pretty hard to flip this guy over and kind of keep it all there, right? You can kind of do it, but it immediately kind of falls apart, and they fall out at some level. So it's pretty tough. So one trick is, usually I have a little rubber pad or whatever that I'll use. Like this guy here, and I'll stick that under and I'll stick it on there. So I'll like set it on here and flip it over. But that made me think, most of the people buying this probably, they don't have this rubber pad, right? And or something similar. So I could advise you to use one of those, but I decided to create a small jig, right? So we've got basically it's just a 3D printed jig. It's printed, very light, and you're really just going to use it once to do this, but pretty simply, just gonna throw the headers in, right, and get them in their place, right, and then this guy is, let's get that guy in there. This guy has an arrow on it. I think you can see it there pretty good, right? So the arrow goes in like that, but you can see it covers all of the headers, right? And then basically you can just kind of set this on here, and it's the right height. It comes in right at the top of these relays. So when we flip it over, it sits pretty perfectly, pretty securely, and holds those pins in. Now, some of you might be thinking that, hey, that's plastic, and when I go to solder those pins in, it's going to melt it. Not really. I mean, if you leave the soldering iron on there really long, yeah, that's going to happen. But you're probably going to ruin the plastic on your headers too at the same time. This in my experience pretty much is unscathed by the soldering process. So you basically, like I said, you throw them in there, you do that, you hold it together, you turn it over, right, and you put it down, and boom, it sits there. It's very stable. You can move it around, right? So kind of a pretty good setup, right? So I forgot to turn my soldering iron on, so we'll turn that on real quick. But basically that's kind of the use of the jig. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through and solder in the headers. If you were watching this to learn about the jig, you can now. I'm just going to solder it in. If you're interested in watching me and getting an example of how to solder these headers in, stay tuned and we'll go from there. Right. So I'm just going to get my solder and I'm going to get my nice clean tip here, which you can probably see some shadow of me getting my nice tinned tip here, and it's pretty simple. There isn't any magic here, but my technique is to have a nice clean tin tip. You can kind of see it a little shiny there, and I typically I'll make sure I'm on the pad that I'm soldering onto, and I'm right up against the pin itself, right? And then you apply the solder to the pin, and it'll do a great job there like that, right? And you can just basically go through each one, you know, And typically I'll solder in one from each. And that way, if for some reason I make a, I make a rookie mistake and I lift this guy up and leave the jig in place, at least, these are in the right place. And I probably honestly don't really need the jig too much anymore, except to make it a good soldering surface, right? So there's kind of the start, but like I said, I did one, I did two in this one, but one in each one. So now I can kind of pick it up and flip it over, whatever I want to do. But I'll still use this just to keep a nice stable base on where I'm going to solder. So now I'm just going to go through the process of doing each one, making sure that I don't leave any kind of bad blobs in place. I'm actually just going to touch these two up real quick. And this one here got a little bit too much solder on there, but make that look nice. All right. Now we're going to go. We're just going to do each one. And this usually goes pretty quick. If you're using a rosin core solder, which I am, um, it doesn't matter if it's lead free or not. It'll work just fine, right? And typically I'll turn it around, make it a little easier. Always apply my iron to the outside of the pin. Right, make sure I can push down on it good and hard. I am accumulating a little bit of solder on here, so I'm going to tap this off and kind of clean that tip a little bit. Go back and suck off, clean that off again. And I come back and hit that process again. Same exact thing for each one. Right, whoop, not quite enough solder there. Right, and if you just apply that right, just pull that solder right onto the board. Right, so there we go. We got one side all done. I'm just going to do the short one here real quick. Kind of slipped and hit the top of the soldering iron there, but no, it doesn't. That sort of works all right. Most of the time you'll get away with it, but you get a little bit too much solder when you do that sometimes. So just keep that in mind. Reheat that one. All right, so make sure we're still in view here. I'm going to go through and do this side. This guy doesn't want to take a little bit. I'm going to put a little more pressure on there sometimes. If you don't put some good pressure on the pad, sometimes that pad won't heat up the way you want it to, and it won't kind of flow real well around it. And you'll get it like on one side or the other. And I think probably if you were paying attention here, you might have seen that happen already. So I'm gonna move this down just a little bit. See if we can get better view on that. Don't know how good the rest of it will be. I guess I'll have to review. Have to see. You can see for this one, I've moved it slightly out from the side there so that I'm not tempted to burn the plastic as I go through and do this one. And it's also one of the reasons I do this last. I'll kind of go like this a little bit, give myself a little more room to work. And try not to slide it right back up against it, John. And we'll go from here. All right, I think that's the last one. We got a few that look like they got a little bit of extra. Maybe they didn't flow that well. So I'm just going to reheat them real quick. Make them look a little bit prettier. All right, not too bad. All right. You saw there that there's a little bit of sticky. The rosin that gets on the board can be a little bit sticky. I typically use an alcohol-based stuff. I'll just brush that off with a brush, clean it up a little bit. I keep a little bit here and just a standard brush, right? And just kind of go through and clean this up like this, right? That typically will do a fair job of kind of cleaning that up in a good way. Um, and we should be good to go from there. All right, there you have it. Ready to go. Looks pretty good, nice and even. And unfortunately, we have this bit of plastic here. Like I said, I print it with very little infill, so it's as little plastic as I could get. But it's a little jig. If you get a bunch of these boards, it's great to have this. But if you only have one or two, you probably don't need this anymore, and you can just toss it with your other jigs. Anyway, there it is. Thanks, everybody.